share this on my Facebook Live. I mean, my Facebook, but I know you're like,
I'll
no.
log back in. I'll remember my password or create a new password and log in and repost the things.
Let me see if I can put. Okay, so good. Okay, so I'm gonna share this to my page.
I don't even know my hand. Is it sad that I don't even know what my like? Are they even called handles? What do you call them now? Like
Yes,
your page
I
name?
call it. Well, I don't know that that's necessarily the technical word in Facebook, but I
Yeah,
call it
clearly I'm
handle.
aging myself. I'm like, I don't know my handle.
This stuff, it just moves at this pace where it's very difficult to keep up, like it's
Yeah.
so much going on. And like I do this every week. I post this to my page every week, and now I'm sitting up here like I can't figure out how to do it because I'm sitting up here talking to you. But that is okay. Here you go.
Mm,
Well, Lisa's got the little thing on there saying that we're live now. So okay, I
okay.
think I got it. Okay, so I guess I didn't play the game with you. So
Mhm.
it's very easy. We're gonna call it Black Love today.
Okay. I
And
notice. I notice my heart beating just a little bit faster. I'm like, the part of me that really likes control and likes to know what's happening is like a little concerned right now.
you will be fine. Let me type this in. uh, someone with. It'd be nice if I. Oh Lord, I was gonna put bipolar disorder. Nope, that's not what we're talking about.
Though they are often confused.
Very true. I remember when I first started, and Becky was so nice to me because I had it confused, and she was just very nice. She's like, "Yeah, people get those confused because I was just talking and talking and talking. I didn't know what the heck I was talking." And she didn't. She was like a very nice supervisor. She didn't just be like, "Shut up, you don't know what you're
Very
talking
gentle.
about."
Let's see. Do you hear me echoing? I think I hear an echo.
It's a slight, well, not an
Okay.
echo, but you can.
I'm gonna put. I think I'm gonna use my headphones just to try to cut back on any feedback. So,
Okay, fair enough. So I am getting this ready. Oh,
okay.
get my timer ready.
All right.
And so our little activity is very easy. I'm going to give you a category. You're going to name 5 things in that category within 10 seconds. That's all you got to do. 5 things.
This feels minimizing of the actual difficulty. You like things on Mars. Name 5 things, and I'm just like, girl, I don't know.
I promise you it'll be a category that you know. 5 things
Okay.
in that category, 10 seconds. Here's the only caveat. You can't use filler words. No ahs, us, no filler words. Just answer
10
the question.
seconds. Okay. I'll see what I can do. And, I am a recovering perfectionist. So this is a great exposure. I'm ready.
Your first category
There's
is
multiple categories.
oh,
We're doing
sorry.
multiple things. Okay. I'm ready. Let's go. Okay. I'm just going to go with it. Ready.
Okay. Your first category is inappropriate things that people say to a therapist. Actually, I'm gonna be nice. I'm gonna give you 15 seconds, and
Thank
I'm
you.
talking, so it gives you time to think.
Okay.
5 inappropriate things that people say to a therapist. No ums, us, ahs. Go.
So I know we just met, but do you know what my diagnosis is? That's one. Two would be, do you see your family members? Like I met your mama. Uh, Three might be
Stop.
three might be.
You
So I know we're in line and we're just waiting to get on the airplane, but let me tell you about fill in the blank. They want sidewalk therapy. That's only three. My answers are very long.
yeah, I see. Because you went over the 15 seconds. Let's try another one. Another category.
I'm very verbose. I can't help it. Okay, I'll work on it.
Another category. Let's see. I got it. I'm going to change up my category so you can type your answers. 5 Black movies that everyone must see. Go.
Okay.
You
Malcolm
just
X.
okay. You got all them fillers in there.
Malcolm X. Brown Sugar. I feel on the spot. I'm not good at this game. I know my 15 seconds are up. This is terrible. I feel embarrassed on behalf of my ancestors and my family members that are still living. This is horrible. I bow out. I'm not good at this. It's the pressure.
Harlem Nights.
Boom. There you go. Can I phone a friend who is better under pressure? Because it ain't me.
Okay, so if you are just watching, we were trying to figure out. Clerissa was trying to tell me 5 Black movies that you must see. We got 2 out of her.
The thing is, I promise you, if we were sitting on the couch, just chatting, just hanging out, I'd be like, "Girl, this, and this." It's the pressure. It just makes the brain go, it leaves.
Okay, can y'all help her? Well, I don't even remember what you said. You said Brown Sugar.
I said Brown Sugar, Malcolm X, because those are 2 of my favorites. You think
we had Harlem Nights.
Harlem Nights, thank you. She's Got to Have It. A Menace to Society.
Okay.
This is terrible. I feel embarrassed. Y'all, I promise I'm Black. I promise I grew up in Atlanta. I promise I'm a native. My parents from Atlanta. My grandparents from Atlanta. Don't judge me based off of this game.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I am here with my amazing sister friend and colleague, Clerissa Cooper, who is a licensed professional counselor. She's also the owner of North Atlanta DBT. She is amazing at the work that she does as a counselor. It's terrible at giving 5 good Black movies.
Yes, this is true. Look, we all have our strengths. This is clearly not mine.
Welcome, sis. Thank you for hanging out with me today.
Hi, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you. Okay, I want to jump in, and I told you my theme this month is we're talking about things from an ancestral perspective, and part of the work that you do is working with folks that have personality disorders, which can be challenging. And I always say, bless your heart, I send them to you. I send that population to you.
Thank you.
So we need folks that do that work. And I really want to jump in and talk about looking at loving someone that has a personality disorder, particularly borderline personality disorder, and how that impacts the people that are really loving that individual. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I want you to start out, though, because sometimes we have clinicians that are watching and sometimes we have people that are not clinicians. And borderline personality disorder is the flavor of the month. People, put it in terrible movies. Like, I don't know if you saw that movie. What is that movie?
The one with Glenn Close, is that
no
one?
That's an old
Girl Interrupted. There's a recent movie about BPD.
Well, supposedly the girl had that in there with the Tyler Perry man.
It's that movie.
Damn, Maddox, you are watching. You still owe me 2.5 hours of my life for that foolishness.
2.5. Yes, the movie with Taraji P. Henson. And I think like Lyric Bent was in it or something. You should have asked me Black actors and actresses. Apparently I could do that.
Terrible.
It was interesting. That's what I'm going to say. It was interesting.
Okay, so she's more diplomatic. That shit was terrible. And that wasn't borderline personality disorder.
It was not.
Stop. But anyway, okay.
Yes, acrimony. Thank you.
That foolishness was. Thank you very much. Okay. So anyway, tell us what borderline personality disorder actually is.
Yeah, so I like to think of borderline personality disorder as a relational disorder. And part of this is that it's individuals who have difficulty relating to the people in their lives, the world around them. They also have a lot of difficulty relating to themselves. So, with borderline personality disorder, we often see folks who have a lot of interpersonal conflict. A lot of that is rooted in like wanting people to be present, wanting a lot of support and a lot of validation, but not knowing how to go about getting that support. And so maybe they act out in some ways, maybe they become more clingy. Some folks do this other thing where they become overly independent because they don't want to feel like a burden to other people, or maybe life experiences taught them that they can't rely on others. There can be, again, a lot of acting out behaviors like suicide, self harm, substance use, other risky behaviors. And one of the other big things that happens with folks that have borderline personality disorder is that they really, really struggle with regulating their emotions. They oftentimes either have a flood of emotions, and so everything shows up in a really, really intense way, or because of that intensity and the discomfort and not knowing how to manage it, they instead learn how to kind of shut down and stuff or numb out their emotions. And so there can be a lot of swinging back and forth between a flood of emotions and a disconnect from emotion. The last little bit is also centered around, again, how they view themselves. And so we say there can be like an unstable sense of self, not really having a clear sense of identity. And so there's this thing I call the chameleon effect, where a person kind of shifts and changes how they show up based on the relationships or the environments they're in, because oftentimes it's centered around either wanting to be accepted or being afraid of being judged or shamed. And so they either hide aspects of their true selves, or they show up and overrepresent certain things because they think that a person might kind of value that and cling to them in that way. So those are kind of the main components when we talk about borderline personality disorder.
So how do people catch it? How do people get it?
Yeah, so we talk about oftentimes folks having a predisposition,
Mm-hmm.
and that is rooted in some biological experiences that they might have. We say that some folks that develop borderline personality disorder have high levels of sensitivity. So they're able to notice emotional stimuli in the environment with less information or much quicker than kind of the average person is because of that hyper awareness or attunement. Now, they might interpret that information or the stimuli that they're picking up on. They might interpret it inaccurately, but they are noticing certain things because of that sensitivity. What
Okay.
then happens is they have the sensitivity and they want something to happen really quickly in response to that. So there's a lot of emotionality that shows up in response to what they notice, and then what we call reactivity, which is either wanting something in the environment to shift and change to attend to what they notice, or they themselves want something to shift and change to kind of either drown out that experience or shift and change it and attend to the experience. And the last biological component or predisposition is what we call a slow return to baseline. That is just a really fancy way to say once I get triggered or emotionally activated, it takes me a lot longer to calm down and get back to where I was before I got triggered. So we've got these biological things that are happening, that
Mm-hmm.
predisposition that then meets what we say is the invalidating environment. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is an environment that either has done something harmful or behaved in a way that's been really traumatic towards the person, or they've been in an environment that might have been loving. And even though they were a loving environment, didn't quite know how to love the person in the way that they wanted or needed. And so it could be an environment that's either under responsive, right? Doesn't quite meet their emotional experience and validate that experience, show an understanding and how to manage the emotions that come up. Or they can be in an environment that I like to say is like over responsive. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the environment that could be hypercritical, the environment that blows things out of proportion sometimes. And again, doesn't quite acknowledge where a person's experience is and teach them how to manage the emotions. And so when a person's been in an environment that tends to be really invalidating of their emotional experience, especially that hypersensitivity that's there, the interaction of the two can then lead to the development of borderline personality disorder.
So you said, okay, you just said something interesting. I didn't, I think I always assumed that people with borderline personality disorder come from abusive environments, but that's not necessarily true.
Not necessarily. I mean, sometimes it can be based on like a discrete traumatic event and the
Okay.
environment. What I see a lot of times with some of my clients is that they've had a very specific traumatic event. And then when they have shared about it with their loved ones, the
They're
loved
dismissed.
ones then dismiss it or don't respond in the way that they need to. And so you've got
Got
the
it.
trauma of the event, plus
Mhm.
you've got the trauma of your family or your loved ones not showing up and supporting you. So it can be a discrete event or it can be more long term, like pervasive relational dynamics. So think more like complex trauma as well.
Now, so making that ancestral connection, is borderline personality disorder something that can pass down in families?
So, my understanding is that right now it is really common that if a person has borderline personality disorder, that they have someone in their family who has demonstrated some similar behaviors. And a big piece of that, remember what I said about that interaction between like your biological predisposition and
Hmm.
the invalidating environment. And part
Hmm.
of the invalidation is like the environment doesn't teach you how to regulate and manage your emotions. So if I too have hypersensitivity and high emotionality and high reactivity and a slow return to baseline, and my mama also has high sensitivity, high reactivity, high emotionality, slow return to baseline, hasn't really taught me how to navigate that experience, then I think that those create some conditions for the dynamic or the personality disorder to get perpetuated in the next generation. So that's really a big way that I think about it. I think that there's room for a lot more research to get done about kind of generational presentations of BPD. But what I oftentimes see with my clients is if my client comes in with the personality disorder, I very quickly am like, let's start talking about your family. What do you know? Tell me about how your mama and
Who's
your
going
daddy
down
and
there?
them, how they engage with you. Yeah, tell me about your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, because there are some similarities in how a family system might function.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's so I kind of want to challenge this around this. Okay, so I think we can kind of stay in thinking about it from a very clinical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Let's break this down for family. So if
Yeah.
you have someone, everybody thinks, oh, you got personality disorder, they'll say you borderline, which is not helpful at all.
Right.
So if Pookie, Ray Ray, and them got personality disorder, how can you tell what's Pookie and Ray Ray and them doing?
So, what are some things, right?
Mhm.
Hypersensitivity, right? Do you have a person in your life who seems to like misinterpret or like really get in their feelings about frequent things that people are saying, even if it seems like a really simple, benign comment? Like, does a person tend to have like a really strong reaction to that? And strong reaction can be like the person like Pookie and Ray Ray being like, hey, don't talk to me like that. And it's a lashing out.
I got it.
It could also be like, does the person start to maybe shut down and get a lot quieter? Because I think, one of the things I see is that oftentimes folks, when they're talking about borderline personality disorder, they talk a lot about, more often about the really visible presentation where like folks are acting out a lot. Folks are like having lots of conflict
Angry.
in their relationships.
Mhm.
They're really angry. They're aggressive.
Mhm.
They're crying all the time. They're filling the blank with whatever these things are we look at. But what's also true is that people can do the exact opposite thing, which is they can start to shut down.
Mhm.
So I think it's important for us to pay attention to that. It's not just an acting out and a becoming more aggressive or more reactive within a relationship outwardly, but it's starting to pay attention. Like, does that person retreat? If they
Mhm.
started to speak up and say something, and now you responded to them, like, do they suddenly like say, oh, never mind, I didn't mean that, don't worry about it, right? Do you notice that people are like in really difficult situations or trying to solve problems, and maybe they needed help but they didn't ask for help, and instead they
Okay.
tried to solve it on their own and things didn't go well? those can also be some really common presentations of borderline personality disorder. But because it's less interpersonally uncomfortable, people don't pay attention to it as much. Folks tend to give a lot more airtime to the presentation that just makes relationships explicitly difficult or explicitly uncomfortable. And so the folks that are quieter tend to get less attention. And those are folks that I think, in my experience, tend to be at a lot higher risk as well.
So it's almost like you're talking about two different extremes. The people that completely shut down, try to do things on their own. I don't need you,
Yeah.
whatever. And then the folks that are over responding. I don't want to say overly sensitive, but like they're over responding to everything. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
they're taking it to the next level. You say something to them, you like, I ain't mean all that. And then
Yeah, they're like, well,
like,
why are you saying that? That's not what I said, right?
mm-hmm.
So it can be that, or it can be a defensiveness,
Mm-hmm.
right? That acting out or acting toward other people. It can be a defensiveness. It could also just be a lot of emotionality, which is like really crying and being like, oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Please forgive me. So it can look really placating as well in some instances. Those are kind of some common acting towards other presentations, I like to say. And then there are the acting away presentations, which is, again, it's the shutting down, the being quieter, the not sharing as much what's happening in experience, doing things more on their own. So yeah, two different directions, I think, when we talk about interpersonally, what happens or can happen.
Now with those experience, like just sticking with that, how do you know the difference between someone that might have a personality disorder that, you're one of your loved ones, this is a personality disorder versus, well, they had a traumatic experience or they are responding appropriately for the situation? How would you how would you tell people to kind of pull those two
Yeah, well, so
apart?
this is the thing. If a person has a personality disorder, they have probably experienced some form of trauma. So it can be both and. It's not
Mhm,
all the time, but most
mhm,
likely there has been some sort of traumatic experience.
mhm,
Again, it could be a discrete or concrete one time single event, or it could be relational over time. So that's
mhm,
one thing to just kind of keep in mind, is that we're always looking for, like, is there relational trauma or
mhm,
complex trauma with the person that has personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. I think that there's actually a lot of folks who are like really being like, maybe we need to step away from the language of personality disorder and just kind of name it as trauma.
mhm,
I do think some other things to think about, though, like PTSD or personality disorder, are some of those other classic aspects of trauma and PTSD present. So is there a lot of avoidant behaviors, like avoiding certain people, places, and things that might remind them of a traumatic event? Is there a lot of hypervigilance and like hypersensitivity, and not just to people and relationships, but to like sensory
mhm,
stimuli and cues? And also just kind of paying attention to, like, how do people navigate spaces? Do they tend to want to know where the doors are and who's around and things like that? So some of our classic trauma symptoms that we pay attention to, that's something that I look for to distinguish, like, is this trauma? Is this a personality disorder? Or is it actually both?
okay.
Does that feel like it answered your question?
Yes and no. I guess I was kind of I was trying to, and probably in a bad way, push towards when people are doing this in multiple environments over and over and over again. That's kind of, it's one thing if, to me, if a person is responding in a particular way to a single event or
Mm-hmm.
a series of similar events. It's a whole other thing where they're over responding or overreacting to their mama, their mate, their friends at work, in the grocery store. Um,
I
then
think I think there's some truth to that. I
Mhm,
also think, though, one of the things to think about is that even folks that have borderline personality disorder, some of their behaviors um, might shift and change based on environment, right? And so
mhm,
I've met clients who are like super, super competent and skillful in like their professional environment, But you get them into their personal relationships, and that's where a lot of chaos starts to show up. Right. So
So
I
no
think
chaos in their personal environment? I mean, in their professional environment at all?
I mean, I've met some really high functioning, very successful folks. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have strong negative emotions and problematic behaviors connected to work, but interpersonally, they behave what we would say is professionally and competently at work. Now, they might have a lot of negative thoughts and a lot of negative beliefs about themselves. They might be having a lot of emotions that they then go in the bathroom or go in their car and self-harm during work. But if we're paying attention to like the relational interpersonal piece, like some folks are more skillful in certain areas than others. And that's one of the things that I try to talk about with folks and with my clients, especially, is like, oftentimes we have somewhere in our life where we actually are skillful and capable and confident. And so can we figure out where that is and figure out what helps you be more capable and competent there? And how do we kind of generalize that or translate that into some of your other environments? So if you can be in a hard conversation with your boss, right? How do we take your ability to do that and translate that to being in a hard conversation with your partner or with a family member or with your friend? So I think there is a lot of truth to what you're describing about like there being like, difficulties and chaos in lots of different places, but it doesn't always look that way. And so I think it's important that we have that understanding as well.
And that's why you're the expert on borderline personality disorder. What did I say at the beginning? When I have folks that come through, I always think this is hilarious. So when we're doing evaluations, when we do these one-time evaluations for folks, and then the staff, so have like psychometrists that will kind of gather some background information, and they'll have like this reaction to someone, and I'll go in and I'm like, oh, that's a personality disorder. And they're like, yeah, really? And I'm like, yeah, that's what you're seeing. That's what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
And they won't know necessarily what that is that they're picking up, but they're just like, there's something not right here. And I'm like, yeah, it's a personality disorder. Bless their hearts.
Yeah. Well, and I think in those sorts of situations, what I also try to do is get clinicians and other folks to like really be able to say, well, can we, instead of like just being like, hey, that person has a personality disorder, so everything that's happening in this dynamic is all about them and their dysfunction, or however we might talk about that. It's also to be able to say, okay, if this is a relational illness or relational dynamic, like, what's my part in the relationship, right? And so how might I be contributing to how uncomfortable this feels? So yeah, a person might be doing this really ineffective relational behavior, and how are we responding to that, right? What's getting activated for us when this person does or says this thing that feels really like problematic, right? We can judge and be like, oh, this behavior, that thing that they're doing. But I encourage folks to be like, okay, well, can we be mindful and check in and be like, what does that bring up for me? What is it about that person being defensive and questioning your clinical ability or your judgment or your boundary, right? What's uncomfortable about that for you? Because if we can start to figure that piece out, like what's our stuff that's wrapped up in it, we then figure out a much more effective way to respond to them that doesn't then exacerbate like the problem, because we're saying it's all you, it's all you, it's all you, you know?
So it's interesting you say that, and I'm just thinking about like families responding, because part of the thing is that I'll see sometimes with folks with different types of personality disorders, particularly if I have a psychometrist come in and they perceive that person is young, then they push boundaries. And then the person is letting me know. And so then we can talk kind of like one-on-one in a supervisory standpoint of like, so what's going on? What do you think is happening for that person to push the boundary, and like for you to think about your response? And then they'll see me come in and the person will try to push the boundary, and I'm just not responding. We're going to hold the boundary. I'm not going to respond to you. And, and then they'll just kind of like simmer down and they're like, oh, like, the difference. And I was like, yeah, because they tried you, and because they tried you and they saw that it worked, when they pushed that boundary, then they just kept going. And so
Yeah.
I think that that is always an important thing to think about is, like you said, like, what's your stuff? When you're dealing with someone that does have a personality disorder and not, I'm going to use the word pathologize. I don't know if that's the right word to use,
I
but
think
not
so.
just try to pathologize and harm the person because they're pushing your boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things as a clinician all this time. Like my entire career as a therapist, I've worked with borderline personality disorder from internship on. And so, one of the things that has really been important for me in terms of working with clinicians, as well as working with like my clients' family members and my clients, is like, how do we come back and find the humanity in folks who have like really uncomfortable survival behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Folks that are ultimately trying to get their needs met, but don't know how to get those needs met. And sometimes because they don't know the need themselves. And
Yeah.
so, how do we maintain a understanding of folks' humanity? And how do we understand and kind of maintain an awareness of like, I have to also show up fully human. And that also means with authenticity, that means with intentional transparency. It means I have to observe my limits or my boundaries, but I have to do it in such a way that oftentimes, like, I'm modeling, like, hey, this is how I need you to engage with me. This is how I need you to treat me. And I think in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which is one of the ways that I work with folks who have BPD or borderline personality disorder, we talk about the dialectic. And different components of the dialectic, that like there can be two or more truths connected to the same experience, right? That you can have a perspective and I can have a competing or opposing perspective. And there can be truth in both of those sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also saying that everything is connected. Things do not happen in silos. And so my responsibility is to be like, okay, what's happening here and how does it make sense? What is this connected to?
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the dialectic, we also talk about like all relationships are very real relationships, and that things are, the language we use in DBT is transactional. I don't really like that language, but I like to say like it is relational and it's generative, right? So what you do and what I do starts to impact one another. So it's not just you're doing this thing or I'm doing this thing, it's that we are in a dance or we are in a dynamic. And so we've got to figure out how is one another impacting and shaping the other person, So these are always things that I try to keep in mind and that I try to get other folks to keep in mind as well. So that if a person's pushing my boundary, I'm not just like, no, firm, this is the limit, suck it up, deal with it. I'm like, okay, this is my boundary. This is why it's my boundary. I'm noticing that seems really uncomfortable for you, that I'm saying no, or that I'm asking for this thing. Can you let me know what is it about my boundary or my limit that feels really uncomfortable for you? How are you interpreting that? What does it mean to you? How do you think I'm viewing you and myself in this? And I think navigating in that way also helps me get out of like the power struggle and make sure that like I, especially as a clinician, making sure that I'm not like wielding all this power in the room and like trying to again get back to a place where like we're equals. Like, yeah, I have a degree and I have a specialization in all these things, but like you also have expertise in your own life. And my hope is for you to start to have better expertise in understanding your emotional needs and being able to ask for those things. And so how do we figure that out together?
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say if you were, what advice would you give to someone whose, let's say, whose daughter is showing signs of BPD? Like, how would you suggest that they set boundaries?
Yeah. So one of the big things that we always talk about in DBT is like validation. That if I am wanting you to observe this limit, and so y'all might hear me interchange boundary and limit because in DBT we use the language of limits, but it just means boundaries. Right. If I am putting this limit out here, a big piece of it is like, I need to be able to like understand the other person and how this is impacting them and what their wants and needs are. And not only do I need to understand it, I need to make sure that I'm conveying understanding. Because again, usually when a person is acting out in some way or their emotionality is escalating, it's oftentimes because they don't feel seen, heard, or understood. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to say, hey, this is my boundary. This is why it is. And I understand why you're asking for or why you're doing what it is that you're doing or asking for or thinking. Right. So the first thing you want to do is validate. Can you identify what's true and understandable about your loved one's thought process, about their emotion, or about their action? Now, it does not mean I approve of it or I agree with it or I want you to keep doing it. Validation simply means I see you as a human and I understand where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's worked real hard to figure out, how does it make sense that this person is doing this behavior that for you might feel really freaking annoying? Like, how does it still make sense that they're doing that? And if I can't figure out on my own how it makes sense, I'm going to start asking questions, right? How can I be curious, open, and non-judgmental to ask questions to better understand why they're doing what they're doing? So that's always first step. I like to call it like, we're going to validate, push, and it's validate their experience, and then we're pushing towards my limit or my boundary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of people, what you got to do on the backside is you got to validate again. And it's again validating like how hard it might be to recognize and accept that my boundary or limit is what it is. It might be validating, you know, the situation that's even led, how hard the situation is that's even led to us having the boundary or the limit. So that is like the biggest number one skill when you're navigating relationships with anybody, but especially folks that have BPD, because they're constantly in this dance of wanting their needs to be met. But I think a lot of times people have these very specific ways they want their needs to be met that might not be realistic for the folks they're in relationship with. So I want to send the message like, I get it. And I can or cannot meet that need. And these are the reasons why, from my very real kind of place as well. So that goes back to this idea that like boundaries can't be arbitrary. Like
Mm-hmm.
it, and this one, this one I still struggle with my mother and my father. I love them.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, they're old school Black folks from the South, and they are jump how high people. And I have never been, bless their hearts, I have never been a how high person. I've always been a, now, why would you like me to jump right now? Right? Yes, I know. You know
Listen,
me well.
you
You
pushing
know this.
boundaries.
I push boundaries, but I'm pushing boundaries because I'm trying to understand, you know? But anyways, the idea here is it's being able to not say, well, you can't do it because I said so. It's being able to say, this is my thought process behind it, or this is what I'm concerned about, and then being able to talk that through. Again, in certain dynamics, there are power differentials, right? If you're a parent and this is your child, there are some power differentials in that relationship depending on how you navigate. But it's, can we get to a place where we see one another as equals? And seeing you as an equal is, so you have a right to understand why I'm responding to you in the way that I am. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And then how would you respond to a relationship? So if you're in relationship with someone, and let's say they've been coming to you, like it's a couple and they've been coming to you, and the partner who does not have BPD has been doing all of, Clarissa's activities of validating and then explaining and empathizing and then sandwiching it with a validation on the end, and the person is still showing their ass. So then
Hey,
what?
now that's judgmental.
It is.
So let's not judge the behavior. That might be, before we even validate, that might be number one. Let's not judge the behavior. The
Okay,
reason I
boo.
say
Then
this
okay,
though,
we'll do it.
the reason that I say let's not judge the behavior is because
Yes, ma'am.
is because I know it is hard. Believe me, it is hard. And the reason I say don't judge the behavior is
Mhm.
because it's going to start to create conflict in itself, right? It's a judgment is a step away from validation. Um, so it prevents us from being able to understand. I think the other thing is judgment actually increases our emotionality. And so the
Mm.
more emotional I become, the more sensitive and vulnerable I am in relationship with you. And so I'm going to be less likely to respond to you effectively because I'm increasing my own, intensity around the situation. So that's the reason that I say it. The
Mhm.
other reason is when we are asking people to change behavior, we want them to be specific. So if I say to someone, I'm gonna need you to stop showing your ass right now, I mean, we can have a general sense of what that means, but a big piece of non-judgmental stance for me is also like, I want us to be really clear about what we're talking about. And so when I say stop showing your ass, what I mean is when we are out in public and people are around, I'd really like you to stop yelling at me because that leaves me feeling really, really embarrassed about how other people are viewing me. And then I can't respond to you in the way that you want or need me to because I now am feeling embarrassed and upset and confused about you yelling at me.
Mhm.
Right. So I want to be explicit about what does that mean so I can also explicitly tell you how I need you to change what
Mhm.
behavior. So there's that piece. The
No,
other piece,
that's a good example. So go with that example. So then what do you do if the person keeps yelling at you in public in front of other people?
yeah. So this is the aspect of dialectical behavior therapy, which is the behavior piece. We do a lot of behaviorism in DBT. And so
Mhm.
what that means is we start paying attention to how are you reinforcing or strengthening problematic behaviors or reinforcing or strengthening desirable behaviors, right?
Mhm.
So what I'm going to try to do is when the person responds in the way that I would prefer them to, which is to say, hey, babe, I feel really upset. Can we talk about this later? Like, that's what I prefer you to do rather than showing your ass and cussing me out in front of these strangers, right?
Mhm.
When you appropriately say, I feel really upset and I want to talk about this later, I'm going to reward that behavior because you've done something desirable. And what will happen, because at the end of the day, humans are animals,
Mhm.
behaviorism is a real thing. Most likely, over time, the more I reward desirable behavior, you'll start to do the desirable thing because you like the reward that you get. That might be me spending more time with you. That might be me being willing to go more places with you. That might be, me giving you more compliments and expressing how much I care about you and how much I appreciate you honoring my boundaries when you do the thing I want you to do. So that becomes the other piece of it. I want to validate and I want to observe my limit and ask the other person to respect my boundary and limit. And when they do so, I want to reward them for it. Right. Now, there are often times where, like, well, not often, but there are instances where reinforcement or strengthening desirable behavior doesn't work. And so we have to move into punishment, which is, in a behavioral standpoint, that means adding something undesirable or taking
Mhm.
away something that is desirable. That's kind of a punishment. We can do that. Punishment is last resort. I always want to reinforce or strengthen a behavior before I try to punish an undesirable behavior. Um, so, what I will usually do is, again, it's explaining. So, I'm going to let them know this is the behavior you're doing. This is why it's problematic or I don't like it or it's hurtful to me. This is what I want you to do instead. And here's the reward if you do the thing that I'm asking for. If you don't do the thing that I'm asking for, then here are going to be the negative consequences of that. And being really clear and explaining that up front. And then based on how they respond, then you make sure that you follow through in a very consistent way with what you say the consequences are going to be. And in terms of like punishment, we want to avoid it as much as possible. It's last case scenario. And what I often do is remind people that the punishment might exist, but like try to explain to them and give them every opportunity to avoid it at all costs. Right. So it's a constant reminder of like, This is the thing I prefer you to do. This is what the benefit of you doing, the thing that I would prefer. Remember, this other thing is over there, but I don't really want to do that. I don't think you would really like it either. So can you please wait until we get in the car to fill in the blank, whatever that thing is, right? Showing your ass.
So it's interesting because as I'm listening to you, I feel exhausted and overwhelmed. And
Yeah.
I would just be like, yeah, no, I can't do this. I'm sorry. Mm-mm. I wouldn't
I
be
think that's
able
understandable, right? I think that that becomes like these other pieces, which is when you're not in the midst of the chaos, right? That's when you want to be having the conversations, right? You want to try to attend to things when things, attend to the problematic behaviors when things are like a bit more balanced or okay. Get an agreement from the other person if you can, like, yes, that
Mhm.
makes sense. Let's do that. So that when you are in the situation, like, we all have an understanding. This is what we agreed on. And I remind the person, hey, this is what we agreed on when things are a bit calmer. So this is how I'm going to follow through. So the reality is, if you're taking a more behavioral approach, it is likely that the problematic or undesirable behavior might get worse before it gets better. In therapy language, in behaviorism language, we call that
Mhm.
an extinction burst, right? Where eventually they're going to hopefully stop the behavior, but before they're going to start pushing and testing those boundaries and limits because they're trying to get you to go back to the old behavior, right?
Mhm.
So that's a very real thing. So what I always tell people to do is like prepare for the extinction burst. It's going to be exhausted. And if you're doing this behavioral thing, what you have to know is the worst thing you can do is, because you get exhausted, go back to the old behavior. That is like the
Mhm.
absolute worst thing. So, what do you need to do to take care of yourself and to make sure you have the support you need to withstand that increase in problematic behavior, so you can ride that out without falling back to the old dynamic? Because if you fall back to the old dynamic and do the old thing, which is start yelling and cussing back with them, right, or whatever that thing is, it's going to be a lot harder to like get back on track. So the other side of it is like, this is hard. Having someone in your life who is struggling in the way that folks with BPD struggle, it's really hard, not just on the person who has borderline personality disorder, but on the entire system. And so it's to say, how do you get support so that you can go where you need to go, where people can also validate you? It's
Mhm.
also, how do you do some self validation? How do you acknowledge, in a non judgmental, really gentle, understanding, and compassionate way, what your own experience is, and how do you attend to your own needs as well?
So, would you say that someone that is in relationship with a loved one that has borderline personality disorder, that family member needs to also be in therapy? Because it sounds like it to me.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, oftentimes at any given point in time, a good chunk of my caseload that I'm working with are the loved ones of folks that have borderline personality disorder, where, I am creating space for them to like talk about what comes up for them and what's really hard about the dynamic. It's also a place where I get to have some accountability and saying, so what are you contributing to the mix? Like,
Mhm.
how are you showing up? That then creates more space for this person to engage in this really problematic way, right? So I'm giving validation, but I'm also holding them accountable and saying, so like, what are you going to do different to create space for this dynamic to be different? They're not the only ones that have to change. The whole system
Oh,
has to change.
I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. And I think to me that that is something really for our community that is a really powerful thing to think about. When we think about therapy, it's not just the individual family member. Even when someone is going to therapy individually, like we're just thinking about family systems and communities changing and healing.
Yeah.
Because, like you said at the very beginning, the person is interacting within an environment.
Well, they're interacting within an environment that, again, oftentimes is doing the, like, they're doing the best that they can. And the dilemma is that the best that they can is insufficient. They don't have the skills or the knowledge or the resources or sometimes just the energy, right? And so one of the other things I try to do with loved ones of folks that I'm working with is to be able to also say, like, what are the ways that you think you're doing the right thing? Let's talk about what you think is the right thing. And then we start to examine, is that actually like the best thing, right? You know, one of the examples I oftentimes use is to help people understand how unintentional invalidation can sometimes be, is I use the example of like a little kid who is in bed and like afraid of monsters under the bed. And so then their caregiver comes in and immediately says, oh no, baby, there are no monsters under this bed. You're good. You're safe. Get on in bed and go to sleep. You be all right.
That does
You
not help
tough.
at all.
That's not helpful.
Not
It's
at
not
all.
helpful, right? And you know, they're usually saying it in a really loving, kind way. Baby, you're good, you're safe, nothing's gonna help you. Sometimes we do this, like, you know, I love Black folks, but sometimes we like to get overly religious with it and be like, God is gonna protect you, which is not what that baby needs to hear. That baby needs you to be like, oh my gosh, you're scared. Okay, is it okay if, you know, if I come down here and look under the bed and see if there's a monster there? Do you want to come down here and look with me so we can see together that there's nothing there? Right? That's actually the validating response, but we think we're doing the right thing by just saying, oh no, there's nothing there, which is actually dismissive and minimizing of that person's experience and emotions. So that tends to be a lot of the work I do in certain families, especially with a lot of my Black clients, is like, there are ways that we as a culture have learned to like suck it up. And sometimes sucking it up is like the worst thing that we can do. We need to actually like notice and name what's happening and let someone know that their experience is seen and that it's respected, and then get support in attending to the problem or the emotion or the issue. And so that tends to be a lot of the work that I do as well. Like, let's talk about what invalidation actually looks like and how it's unintentional. You're a really good parent and you're not a perfect parent. So let's figure out how we can do some things differently.
So it's really interesting because I don't remember my daughter saying anything about monsters per se, but I remember thinking that I was going to be proactive. So, like, I had dream catcher in the room, and I had like just different things around the room, and we would just kind of talk about like nighttime, and reading a book before bed. We do these things to talk about nighttime being like a good experience. And, when they wake up in the morning, it's like, did you have a dream? Did you go to the realm of the ancestors? So, but I can remember from being a little kid, there wouldn't have been any way that I would have said anything about being scared. And I was scared of the dark, but I wouldn't have said anything about it at all.
Yeah. Well, and so that's something else to think about. What are the ways that folks are afraid of disappointing us? And so they're not telling the truth. They're not being fully authentic because they're worried of disappointing us, or they're worried that if they do tell the truth, it'll be something completely different than what you believe or what you want to hear. And so they just don't say anything. They hold on to it, and then they're struggling with something like on their own, which then can lead to some of those other acting out behaviors, right? If I don't feel like I can talk to you about certain things, but when I act out, you start to pay attention and attend to that, right? That could also be a part of what's happening in the dynamic. And so I think a big key is to just show up with openness. And so rather than, I think all the things you just described about creating the conditions for peaceful rest, I think all of that is brilliant and beneficial in what's needed. And the other piece is to come back and not necessarily be like, did you have any good dreams or da 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 da? Instead say, how was your sleep last night? What is there anything that came up that you want to share with me? And so we're not sending the message that it should be good or it should be bad. We're just saying, what was it? Tell me about that. And then we can respond accordingly. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, but I'm talking about my comment was kind of from a spiritual perspective when you ask about that kind of stuff. But that's a whole other.
Well, say some more. Because say some more. I don't want to
Like,
miss
if I'm
that.
saying, like, did you have any dreams? And you go to the realm of the ancestors, it's the belief that the dream space takes you to that realm of the ancestors. So
Yeah.
it's a neutral space. So something, I mean, it can be something that is not necessarily happy, that happens there. It could be something that's
Yeah.
good. So to me, that is very different. When I think about the dream space, it's very different than just, strictly like nightmares and,
Yeah.
the dreams of you flying in the air and stuff like that. So that's where my question would, when
Yeah,
I
no.
would come out.
No, no,
That,
no. I'm glad. No,
yeah.
I'm glad we backed up then, because I think then that is an appropriate way to respond, is just to say,
Mhm.
like, what happened? Like, I'm really and I think one of the things that I often say to people, so that I don't send the message that they should or shouldn't have done one thing or another, and I just like, oh, I'm just really curious, or I
Mhm.
wonder if. And so it
Mhm.
can be like, did you go, did you go to the dream space where you were with your ancestors or with our
Mhm.
ancestors? Like, let's talk about that. I think that
Mhm.
that's actually a really appropriate way,
Mhm.
an appropriate way to respond, as long as we're like making sure that like whatever shows up is really fine.
Mhm.
And what I also recognize is, for myself, like my own conditioning and my own kind of background is showing up, because my parents would not be like, did you go to the dream realm with our ancestors? And was it positive or was it negative? Or like, what happened there? Like, they didn't show up with curiosity. My parents are hyper religious. And so
Mhm.
they show up with like, I love them, and a measure of like spiritual bypass, which is like,
Mhm.
only good things can come up when we are, doing this thing. So it's just me kind of naming like, what you're saying sounds actually really appropriate and validating. But my understanding was just informed by my mom and my daddy.
No, and I don't. Yeah, I mean, well, we won't get into that. We could talk about dreams another time. And
Yeah.
I think that there can be a lot of interesting things there.
Hmm.
I'm wondering. Oh, we only got 4 more minutes left. This is insufficient time to talk about this. So maybe we have to come back and talk about this.
Okay.
The impact of racism, white supremacy, homophobia,
Yeah.
misogynoir, all of those things on specifically Black women that have borderline personality disorder. I'm interested in the impact on identity development.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is important to pay attention to is when we talk about the development of borderline personality disorder, and we talk about it being relational and a person can experience traumatic invalidation. Uh, Systems of oppression are forms of traumatic invalidation, right? And so in the work that I do, I specifically have a DBT skills group that is specifically for adult Black women, where we talk about all of the intersections of our identities and
Mhm.
ways that oppression contributes to a lot of the difficulty with emotions and navigating the world that we have. So
Yeah.
I think that is a really important conversation to have, is like, how does that inform how you view yourself and how you view the world around you? And I think what I see a lot with the clients that I work with are the ways that we are taught to minimize and belittle and invalidate our own selves, the ways that we are taught to be mules for other people. And so we start to minimize our own experience and we don't care for our needs. We instead do sometimes like
Mhm.
a clinging and a codependency with other people, because that's what we've been conditioned to believe our role is. I think oftentimes we have conversations around like righteous anger, and we talk about, yeah, with borderline personality disorder, for some people, intense expressions of anger is a part of that illness. But we also talk about like, why do you have every right in the world to be enraged? And how do we use your rage in a way that's actually going to serve you and be beneficial for you? And how do we validate that rather than just wrapping it up and being like, oh, you're so sensitive? Like, yeah, you're sensitive. There's value to being sensitive as long as we can figure out what to do with it. And then to say like, so how do we manage that sensitivity and the fact that like you live in a world that's not made for you, right? Or that's been shifted
Mhm.
and altered. And so how do you actually keep that anger, because it's going to fuel you towards something that's beneficial for your own life, your family, and also your community. So those are some of the conversations we tend to have a lot in my Black Women's Skills group.
I love it. I love it. I love it. My colleagues, Sister Clerissa Cooper, who is a licensed professional counselor and the owner of North Atlanta DBT. How do people get in contact with you?
Yes. So if you were here at the beginning, what you know is that I have Instagram and Facebook, but I don't use those things. So if you get on there and look for North Atlanta DBT, you will see my smiling face in the icon picture. And you will find me. I think it's North_Atlanta_DBT. On Instagram and on Facebook, it's North Atlanta DBT. You can also go to my website, which is NorthAtlantaDBT.com. That's how you find me.
I just put it up there.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, my sister, for
Thank you.
coming and having this conversation with me. Definitely, I want to continue to have this conversation again.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to come back.
Okay, everyone, thank you for hanging out with us. Please do me a favor. If you are just watching, like this, share this, and consistently come and hang out with us. We are here every single Friday at 12 o'clock talking about all kinds of stuff that has to do with mental health, with African spirituality, with culture, and the history of people of African descent. Take care.
Bye.